Welcome to VintageTech, the show where we talk about old technology that are popular and unpopular, recognized as good. Now, for this episode, we'll be talking about a game system that both jump-started and ironically almost destroyed an industry single-handedly. The Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, later renamed, as we all know, to the Atari 2600. This was a really revolutionary system. And it's come to think, it came out in the 70s, produced by Atari. Now, you can tell it screams 70s because of the wood-grained, and look at those ridges. Now, I wasn't born in the 70s, I was born in the 2000s, but I am fascinated by these old tech, which is why I collect them to do videos on them. Anyway, let's start with the brief history about it.
Introduced at CES in June 1977 and released in September of the same year, the Atari VCS, later renamed 2600, became one of the first home consoles of the second generation of video games. The VCS was not the first console to use cartridges. That distinction belongs to the Fairchild VES, later renamed Channel F. But because of the VCS's packing game at the time, Combat, and coming with 2 joysticks, it became very popular during its first 6 years on the market. Now, for this episode, I'll refer to the VCS as the 2600, due to Atari's newest console being called the VCS, and to avoid confusion of their names.
Well, that was a brief history. Now, the Atari is very ancient. This is the granddaddy of video game systems. Well, in terms of how they are designed. Cartridges, power switches, and controller ports. Now, Atari was founded in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell, and their first successful game was Pong, which is based on Ralph Baer, founder of video games, Black Box, which later became the Magnavox Odyssey, the first ever video game system. Though technically, it's more of a plug-and-play device because, well, those cards actually contain jumpers, and you put overlays on the TV that take advantage of the static on the CRT, which were common at the time. And then, Atari was born, became well known for their system, the Atari 2600. And this is the only successful system Atari has produced. Because, well, you know the story. Anyway, time to talk about this system!
The Atari 2600 is powered by a MOS 6507 processor running at 1.19 MHz. The processor that produces the audio and video for a 2600 is a television interface adapter, or TIA for short. The documentation for TIA is a bit complicated, so I will not explain it. The Atari 2600 has 128 bytes of RAM, and game cartridges can have up to 4 kilobytes of ROM. On the back, we have 2 DB9 game ports, which are used for the controllers. Now, these ports are also used on other systems, including Atari's home computers, the VIC-20, Commodore 64, Amiga, MSX computers, and even the Sega Genesis! There is even the RF cable, which is, sadly, hardwired into the system. So if it's broken, you're out of luck unless if you mod the console that has standard RCA outputs. Then there's the power output, which uses a connector similar to a headphone jack. And one unscripted thing here, on the bottom there's even a channel selector switch, which is on this model, the Atari 2600, not the early ones. So, something I need to point out. On the top is where things get interesting. We have the power switch, color or black and white selection, difficulty switches for the left or right player, game select, and game reset. Now, except for the power switch, programmers can program those switches to do different functions in games, which means that those switches do different things depending on the game. Then, saving the best for last, we have the cartridge port. This is where you insert the game cartridges. Due to the way Atari cartridges are designed, you are unable to see the front label for the game.
Okay, now here we have is the joystick. This is really the real star of the system, and iconic controller up until the NES. Now, we have, obviously, the joystick. You can only move in 8 directions, which despite what people think nowadays. And then we have a button called the fire button. And that's a single button. Now, here's how it works. Your left hand holds the base and doubles the button, while your right hand uses sticks. In contrast to what a modern gamepad does these days, where you have your directional inputs on the left, and your action buttons on the right. Like, this Xbox controller example has the directional inputs on the left, and your action inputs, A, B, X, Y, on the right. Now, Now, the cord here is relatively short, which means you're not going to sit far away from your TV to play it. But then again, you're most likely going to touch the console, so I guess that explains it. Now, here's where the real action begins. Let's demonstrate those switches! Alright, now, let's hook up the Atari to the TV first. Now, hooking up the Atari is a lot more difficult than what you might think. This cable right here contains both the video and the audio, much like HDMI, but more cumbersome. You have to set this to either one of those switch boxes that you might get at your Radio Shack, and then set the box to channel 3 or system itself. Then you have to tune to the right channel. That is a lot cumbersome. Now, fortunately, the Celadus 2600 that you might see in this video actually is supplied with one of those little adapters that you can buy for very cheap. And that's a lot simpler. In fact, I kept this screwed onto this TV so just in case I buy a retro game system that only uses RF. Look at you, Pong consoles. Anyway, let me hook this up. Anyway, let's plop in a game. And what better way to demonstrate than combat? In fact, this game was actually the packing game for the system when it was launched in 1977. Let's put it in. Oh, forgot the most important thing. The joystick, of course. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is that this was actually a second joystick for a system. The first one had a more orange outline and was not really suitable for gaming. So, a year later, Atari made this one, and that was a more renowned one, until third-party joysticks came. Anyway, let's plop this in. And turn TV on. Alright, here goes nothing. And little did you know, it worked! Yeah. Now, you might notice on the TV that the color might change. And that's more of a screensaver, which not only makes it more engaging, but also protects from any burn that those old CRTs are notorious for. And nowadays even OLEDs too. But anyway, the TV type are color, black and white. Color or black and white. Do we have left or right difficulty? Unfortunately, combat does not work. And it's a two-player game. The game select, though, can let you pick different games. And then, game reset. Yep, it starts the game. Oh boy. Of course, combat's an exclusively two-player game. Let's try another game to demonstrate. Space Invaders! Space Invaders! Yeah. Oh, and one quick thing. You might notice it says Sears Telegames. That's because when the Atari was sold in Sears, they rebranded it under their video arcade. They're literally the same other than the branding. So anyway, let's pop in some Space Invaders. And, now this is where I demonstrate those switches. You know, left difficulty, guess what? It makes it bigger. So I don't think it might see it, so a little crop posting will help. Let's set to advanced. Oh, you can move it, but you have to press set. Now, the graphics are CPU driven, which means which means both game code and the graphics have to run at the same time, compared to nowadays with GPUs. And this is really noticeable with some colors. Oh shoot. Oh boy. Yeah, if you notice those little black bars on the screen, that's because game code is running. So if you're wondering why is that there, you'll know why. Now, the game selector, which I demonstrated in combat, actually, let's select a different game. Let's see. Moving shields. I want this one, this is where the aliens can jiggle a bit. And this is both. And this is one is a lot tough. Especially if yeah, you see what I mean? I recommend we keep it on easy difficulty. So that's how the aliens will... Ugh. Of course, let's try a game that actually uses the button to start a game. And of course, I got to try out. The worst port of Pac-Man. Let's go, or should I say, walk to go. Now, this is one notorious. Yep, that's the one where you press the button to start, rather than pressing the reset button. Come back here, you ghouls. Now this one is... Oh, never mind. Yeah, I forgot. You know, this game later became the packing game. And this was one of the worst ports. I mean, heck, even the Atari soft versions for Commodore computers was actually better. Anyway, I guess that's it for the demonstration, but we're not done yet. There are some more things about the 2600, and I mean the different models it got over the years.
In 1980, Atari introduced a 4-switch version of the 2600, which resulted in the difficulty switches being moved to the back. Other than that change, the motherboard inside is now a single motherboard instead of 2 motherboards connected via a ribbon cable. Speaking of 2600, that's the CX numbers for these consoles, as the original from 1977 is called CX2600, and the 1984 Switch model is called the CX2600A. By 1982, Atari introduced the first model to be called 2600, an all-black console. But you may never guess what fans often refer to this model as. That's right, the Darth Vader system. Other than the color, it's the same as the earlier 4-switch model. Finally, in 1986, 3 years after the great video game crash of 1983, Atari released the 2600 Junior. This model is a redesigned version of the Atari 2600 that resembled more of the 7800. Rather than using switches for the game select and reset, they use buttons instead. Additionally, the Junior has an RF output as a separate jack rather than being hardwired, which means it's easier and cheaper to replace the RF cable than the entire console. Oh, and the power switch now has a lightning cable below it, which makes it easier to test whenever it's working.
Well, those are interesting Atari revisions. Oh, there is actually the early heavy 6-switcher, which I do not have. I have this light 6er. Now, the heavy 6-switcher has this Made in Sunnyvale, California sticker, and more 6 chrome switches, to be exact, and more rigid edge. I forgot what it was. Oh, and another revision is, I forgot to mention, is a Japan-only system called the Atari 2800. Now, it was released only in Japan, but it did come to the US under a different name. But what that controller makes the controller unique is that The controllers are wireless, incorporating a paddle and a joystick all in one. Genius! However, you know what also arrived in 1983? The Nintendo Famicom, which became the system that we all know revived the video game industry. And that system dominated Japan compared to the Atari 2800. Now, in addition, there were some official clones of the Atari. I already did mention the Sears Telegames, but Sears did release the Atari 2800 as the Sears Telegames Video Arcade 2. Yeah, so you Americans might already see that system. In addition, Coleco made the Coleco Gemini, which was later released as a Columbia Home Arcade, and they're both same systems. And the controller, though, was really interesting. It also had a joystick and a paddle as separate things, which was pretty unique idea. Anyway, now that I talked about the Atari, I need to talk about the accessories.
Alright, time for the accessories. Now, since there is an abundance of Atari 2600 accessories out there, I will only be focusing on the official accessories for this video. Official as in first-party accessories. First things first, we have the PAL controller. Or should I say, controllers, because both PALs share the same connector. So, theoretically, most if not all PAL controller games support 4 players. Such as Breakout, the PAL controllers have potentiometers and are analog controllers. Because of this, they use 2 additional pins on the DB9 ports. However, they are known for being jittery, so please clean them if necessary. There's also a driving controller for 2600 that works with only one game! And that game is Indy 500 for the 2600. However, that controller looks familiar when you look at it. That's because the controller itself is the PAL controller with slight modifications to it. There is also a keyboard controller used for some games like Brain Games and Star Raiders. The controller also has slots so that it can link up to another keyboard controller. This got me thinking. Nope!
Well, those were all the official Atari 2600 accessories. Oh, one thing I actually forgot to mention is that the Atari CX42 joystick, which is the first ever first-party wireless controllers. It predates modern gaming of how to use wireless controllers these days. But the Atari was a bit primitive. You plug the receiver in the Atari, and then you can use the joysticks, which means you can play from far away without the console near you. Though, then again, having the console near is a bit more convenient because, well, you might have to touch the systems every so often, thanks to those little switches. And there's also a trackball, which is best suited for games like Centipede and Missile Command, which, you know, those arcades were originally designed with a trackball in mind. Anyway, time to show some cartridge designs. Starting with the earliest first-party titles that were released from the system's launch. These are the only 2 text labels I have. So we have here is Combat and Breakout. Now, these early ones actually list the different games. So, let me just focus for a bit. Anyway, games 1 through 5 is Tank, 6 through 9 is Tank Pong, which is seen in demonstration. 0 for 14 is Invisible Tank, 15 for 20 is Biplane, and 21 for 27 is Jetfire. And notice that it says, use with joystick controllers. They actually specify what controllers they use. Most of them use joystick, but some, like Breakout, use with standard PAL controller. Now, actually, I want to show you something. This is a box for when an Atari game comes in. A colorful cardboard box that shows the picture for the game, and the CX number, and the Atari logo. However, notice that it says a Warner Communications Company. Why is that? Well, in 1978, Atari was bought out by Warner Communications. And as you might expect, their logo had to be present on the box art. Now, Warner Communications is the parent company of Warner Bros. Pictures at the time. which means you can trace Warner Bros. Games being the only surviving game publishing division of a movie studio all the way back to the Atari days. Which, I have a feeling they won't stick around. Anyway, now these labels were phased out in favor of some labels with pictures on them, as seen in games like Berserk, Pac-Man, and Asteroids. Now, they actually have pictures on them. But the Atari had user imagination because those pictures don't reflect what the game is. Now, we have these textured plastic shells. On the back, we get this, you see a game logo. And then here we have is a cartridge slot. Notice that they are completely shielded, protecting them from dust, which was good forward thinking, considering you know how most game cartridges, well, you know, are notorious for collecting dust these days. I'm looking at you, NES. Now, notice how these have these little pins. And that's because on the Atari itself, those pins are needed to unlock the cartridge slot so that it can play the game. And now these little things are what open it. However, it should be noted that not all cartridges feature them, particularly the third-party ones. However, some of them... Oh yeah, what I forgot to mention is that they did adopt silver labels, as seen with this Mario Bros. One. They actually have a little spring into it, which makes them a lot more fidgety if you ask me. Yeah. And I believe this thing was patented by Atari, both springs and this design, because it's not seen on the third-party cartridges. Though, then again, the final Atari 2600 games didn't even have that little dust cover, although it still has those little pins in them. And this is a Junior Pac-Man, by the way. Yeah, I'm not sure why they had to remove it. Now, in contrast to how most games are presented these days, in terms of physical appearances, well, outside discs, the cartridge design is varied by the company who made the game, or ported it, rather than the console manufacturer. Starting with, arguably the best of Atari games, Activision. And yes, that is by the way the same Activision who likes to milk Call of Duty these days. But before they became the Activision we all know and love to hate these days, they're actually producing, correct me if I'm wrong, quality titles for the Atari 2600. Which is no big surprise considering they were founded by former Atari employees. And that's because 4 Atari employees were fed up with how their CEO at the time, Ray Kassar, treated them. And so, this is why Activision exists. It's because they want better. My, how times change. Now, let's look at the label. You may think that Black Box NES games figure out what game you are? Oh, you haven't seen the Activision titles. Here we have is Pitfall, arguably one of the best games of all time. And Kaboom, which uses the PAL controllers. And then we have, yeah, these Activision games are notorious for being, wearing down over time. Chopper Command, which is think like Choplifter. Now, here we have the Activision logo. Man, like how it's textured. Now, what makes these cartridges look cool is you can actually stack it like this and they won't shake around and slip off. And this is why I recommend you keep them separate, because they look cool. Now notice they don't have a little shield. Well, some of them, like this Kaboom cartridge, has these little springs. Finally, 66 actors, and we have companies like Imagic. As a matter of fact, Activision did buy out some of Imagic's games, which is why I'm wondering why I see games that are from Imagic on the Activision Anthology for PSU you don't want. Anyway, this is Cosmic Arc, the only Imagic game I own. Well, if I get more after this recording, not upload date, this may not be accurate. Anyway, these looks like a little handle. And look how thin it is. It makes it easier to grab the cartridge out with one hand. I stand incorrected. You're supposed to pull out a cartridge like this. I think the handles on there just for easy insertion. Oops. I'm not sure if I'm sarcastic or not, but whatever. And then we have competitors porting their games onto the Atari, like the M Network, which is Mattel's Atari 2600 publishing division. And this is Space Attack, the only one I own so far. Now, notice the cartridges looks odd, and that's because the cartridges themselves are actually Intellivision cartridges, slightly modified to fit in the Atari. Yeah, cheap, but effective. And of course, we have one of the most common type of porters to the Atari, Parker Brothers. Yes, that same Parker Brothers is not who made the Merlin, as seen in episode 11. Anyway, look how unique this design are. We have Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, and Q*bert shown here. Now, look at those little ridges. And at the back it says, Parker Brothers. Now, Parker Brothers used this cartridge design on many other platforms, including the ColecoVision and Atari's 8-bit computers. Now, the only way to tell is that all cartridges have a different color label. So if it's a silver label, that's the Atari. Although technically they're a bit wider to fit. And then the final one I'll be demonstrating is Encounter at L5 by Data Age. Yeah, this is a cartridge design that CGR Publishing did not show in his original video. And that's the only PAL game I actually had when the bundle I found online. Anyway, they are a bit silvery, and notice that this has a little edge to it, which means you can't stack it like this, but you can like this. Yeah, there are more cartridge designs, but I think explain one of them. Coleco actually did cartridges in white. I don't have them yet, so I'll show an image right now. Now, the reason why they're colored white is that they can actually differentiate themselves from the Coleco version, which uses black cartridges. However, it should be noted that some Coleco games, and by some I meant the ones by Nintendo, Donkey Kong Jr., which, as a former, were ported to the Atari as one of the late system's lifespans. You know, this one? Yeah. And CBS Electronics actually did great cartridges, but, oddly, they can link to an Activision cartridge like this. Yeah, that's something I should point out.
Ironically, the abundance of third-party developers and lacking quality control for the system resulted in one of the most infamous moments in gaming history. That's right! The great video game crash of 1983! Oh, wow. That was the most infamous moment. The factors that involving the disaster can be attributed to the following things, all of which from the Atari 2600. The horrible port of Pac-Man, the Atari porn games, yuck, especially the ones from Mystique, and of course, E.T. These factors are the reason why video games became a negative thing for 2 years. Resulting of the crash, Atari was forced to split into two, Atari Corporation and Atari Games. The former was sold to the late Trammell, founder of the computer company Commodore, and the latter produced arcade games like Paperboy and Marble Madness. Mattel spun off their Intellivision division, and Coleco, well, just died. Hell, even some of the consoles, like the Vectrex and the Magnavox IC2, became discontinued as well! As a result bad. Although there were some video games released during the crash, the industry would recover to a certain Japanese company, and a red-capped plumber saved the industry in 1985. But we'll talk about that in a future episode.
Yeah, that great video game crash was really the most disastrous moment. I actually never heard about crash because I wasn't even born in that era. Although whether or not the crash was the case, nowadays, games released today have to specify what platform they're on, especially if they're a disc-based game. Anyway, time for the gameplay. Now, for the first time, rather than use an emulator, I'll be capturing them with hardware directly, rather than using having the camera face the screen, which we all know how bad that DS episode turned out. But I will not be using the real hardware. I'll be using a clone system with an HDMI output, which I will mention at the end near the end of the video. Also, a word of warning: if you are susceptible to any flashing lights, skip this section immediately. Anyway, let's begin! really interesting gameplay. Now, the graphics were a bit primitive, so you have to use your imagination to figure it out. Oh, and one quick thing! If you're wondering why there are only 2 ghosts in that Pac-Man gameplay footage, that is actually my capture card! And we all know how worse that Pac-Man port is. So you may think it's very worse than you think. No, that's actually just my capture device, so please ignore it. Now, what's the Atari like after the crash?
The Atari 2600 continued after the 1983 crash until 1991, when it was discontinued. The last officially released game on the platform was the 2600 port of Clax, released in 1990, but only in Europe. The last officially released Atari 2600 game in the US is Secret Quest, released in 1989. Because of this, the Atari 2600 became the longest running game system on the market, lasting nearly 15 years since its introduction, and selling over 30 million units worldwide. However, there is a thriving community that continues to make titles that push the hardware to the limits. Heck, there's even official modern re-releases of Atari's own 2600 games on cartridges, which I forgot about until after writing the script.
Well, Atari's longer lifespan actually made it also compete with the highly successful NES and the Sega Master System. Which, by the way, the Sega Master System had to have publishers like Activision and Parker Brothers on it. But the Atari games looked very primitive compared to the NES. Well, at least they had a long lifespan. And I didn't expect them to port Clax, which is, by the way, an Atari Games game, which is now owned by Midway, which nowadays owned by Warner Brothers. Yeah. Now, what about playing Atari 2600 games these days?
Now, after playing Atari 2600 games today, you have a variety of options. You can play them on real hardware, though this is slow and cumbersome. Plus, finding a working one can be very difficult because these systems are very ancient. Most, if not all, of the Atari 2600 games can be played on the Coleco version with a special peripheral. In addition, certain versions of the Atari 5200 can also use an adapter to play 2600 games. But since the infamous 5200 has its games, we'll cover that system in a later date. The true success of the Atari 2600, the Atari 7800, is backwards compatible with 2600 games and peripherals. Then there is the Retron 77 by Hyperkin, a modern clone of the console that has an HDMI output, making it easier to use on modern televisions. In fact, that's how I was able to capture 2600 game footage for this episode. In addition, there are multiple plug-and-play devices and game compilations with Atari 2600 games included in the upcoming Atari 50th Anniversary Collection. So they are a good option, but if you don't have the cash to buy them, you can use a Stella emulator.
If you're like me, I recommend collecting the real hardware, so I can use the actual peripherals like the joysticks and the paddles. Oh, and these DB9 ports, you can use any modern controller like the Sega Genesis, which most people prefer to use because of the D-pad, but you can also use the Sega Master System controller. And even the Atari 7800 joysticks and gamepads. But you cannot use Atari 7800 joysticks or gamepads on the Sega Master System due to the way how those controllers work. Now, I always prefer the real joystick because, well, you know, authenticity, but you can also go for the Hyperkin Retron 77, which I got that solely for the purposes of gameplay captures, or the Atari collections, including the upcoming Atari 50th Anniversary, as I mentioned before, which, if you watch it in the future, it might already be out, or even the Activision Anthology for the PS2. That's PlayStation 2, by the way. Now, anyway, with that, the Atari 2600 episode is complete. Now, before I end, Atari later used this VCS name on their new system called the Atari VCS. And I guess video computer system is kind of fitting because the Atari VCS is literally redesigned computer compared to the Intellivision Amico, which infamous for the scandals. Anyway, with that done, I'm going to take this Atari 2600 and the stuff out of my bedroom and into some place you might see in the future. wait, cut the music, please. Now, this will be the place where future VintageTech episodes will be published. Well, sometime in the future. This is called a museum/library, where this museum section will show the different tech I collected. I'll be on the other side. Now, I need to explain some things. Originally, this was supposed to be the 10th episode after the DS episode, but due to the DS episode becoming a two-parter, I actually had to postpone it until the 13th episode. So, that's a production issue. Anyway, next episode of Vintage Tech, it'll be about the Polaroid 600. It's gonna be about camera this time, so keep that in mind. Anyway, like and subscribe, and ring the little bell to know about my loser. I'll see you later.